is Dawn Rowe. I'm the executive director and founder of Girl Vow. We, just in case you hear some background, I live in the city, so hopefully I prayed that it'd be quiet, but you never know. I live in New York City, so just in case. My pronouns are she and her. So I'm the founding executive director of Girl Vow, a gender-focused mentoring program for girls and LGBTQ youth that have been impacted by the foster care and the juvenile justice system, and also poverty, which of course is the underlying cause. So we've been doing this work since 2015, and my experience comes, well, the work, I've started the organization from my experience, which comes from me dealing with parental abandonment, me being suicidal. I was a high school dropout at the age of 16. And I was really dealing with a lot of issues in terms of like family issues. I was kicked out of school. When I was younger, during my teenage years, I was kicked out of school. And I remember specifically one time going into school, and the teacher was like, you haven't been here, so you have to leave, and that's it. And I was dealing with, like I said, so much. So as a result of the things that I was experiencing, I tried to take my life also, like I said, in terms of parental abandonment. So I do this work, and it's personal for me because I work with so many young girls and women that have had the same experiences. The girls that we work with, oftentimes they're transient. They've been impacted, of course, by poverty. They're sex survivors. They may have parents that have different psychosis. They are on probation. They're in the foster care system. They're high school dropouts. So they may have abused drugs. So, you know, like I said, this work is very personal for me because of that, and because I understand the population, and because my life too mirrors a lot of the experiences that they've had. So this work, I said, is personal for me, and I'm just really happy to be here.
Yes, well, thank you so much for sharing that, Dawn. We're so grateful to have you here. Could you just tell us a little bit about COVID-19's impact on, you know, on your community?
Yeah, COVID-19 has really decimated our communities. When I think about, when we think about poverty, and oftentimes when we think about poverty, we oftentimes don't really put a face to poverty. But I think COVID-19 has done that. So we went from dealing with young people and families that are dealing with just, I guess, generalized poverty, if you will, to now extreme poverty. So that means not being able to pay your rent, not being able to buy food, not being able to buy diapers. So we work in an area it's a highly impoverished area. There's a lot of families that are in need. It's an urban community. And because of the impact that COVID has had, a lot of our families, like I said, they are really, really struggling. I got a call last night from a young woman about 1 o'clock in the morning who needed transportation and didn't have, like, it was stuck somewhere and didn't have money for transportation. So there's so many things that are happening right now. There's so many things in terms of mental health that is happening. When I think about trauma, and I think about the fact that oftentimes institutions don't prepare young people and families on how to deal with trauma, how to deal with crisis, how to deal with a known crisis, right? When you're not prepared for it. So COVID-19 has really reared its head in terms of just showing up and showing how we are so like we're not ready to provide the services. We're not ready to take care of our own communities. We've done such a bad job at abandoning our families that what's happened with COVID is really, really silence our families' abilities to even use their voice. I have a couple of families who also are dealing with domestic violence. There's a lot of domestic violence issues that are happening as well because of families always being together now because they are not able to go to school or go to work. And so there's a lot of things that are happening right now as a result of COVID.
Wow. I mean, you guys have your hand in so many different pots right now. That sounds like there's a lot going on. Do you want to speak more to kind of this, like the impact that the economic insecurity is having on, you know, girls who are in foster care systems or even in juvenile detention or coming out of that?
Yeah, I think that the problem with economic security is, like I said early on, in terms of we haven't really addressed the issues of poverty. A lot of times it's swept under the rug. And because you have Black and brown girls that are often forgotten, their needs are forgotten, their families are forgotten, and it's an afterthought. There's been a lot of talk around the idea that people who and families that do the essential work, that do work in like supermarkets and nursing homes and things like that, they're essential, right? Those are your minimum wage workers. And a lot of our families work in supermarkets. They work their home health aides, and they haven't felt essential for a very long time. So imagine all of a sudden now, now that you're essential, but that conversation has gone away now, and it's sort of been retired. So when we look at economic insecurity, those economic insecurities haven't gone away. And we believe that now, because of COVID, this is going to be a generational effect, right? So this is going to happen for some time. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And so we're really trying to figure out ways that we can support families through the crisis for the next couple of years, not just for what's happening right now.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, these issues of poverty and lack of healthcare, these have been so prominent in so many communities, and just what you're talking about right now with COVID, it's just exacerbated all of this. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about kind of like the institutions, like the crisis response systems, or the social welfare systems, or the healthcare systems. How have they, been able to respond and been able to help? Or
Yeah, so our institutions have historically failed Black and brown people. So that hasn't changed, unfortunately. Even when I think about like institutions, and I think about like structural like inequalities, and I think about the fact that institutions are supposed to provide like consensus, stability, support, cohesion, right? There's been a failure in the ability to do so. When you think about institutions, you think about all these different parts that are supposed to work together to make a system whole, right? But the problem with institutions is that minorities are often targeted in such a way that institutions fail them, right? So institutions get to determine who wins and who loses. And because the issue of poverty and COVID is inextricably tied together, because it's tied together, there like nothing has really changed in terms of being able to provide support. In actuality, it's gotten worse. So because institutions have generally failed, and because as Black girls, we're taught not to trust institutions, right? So when we think about institutions, we think about like the educational system, we think about government policies, laws, and historically those things have not worked for us. They have not showed up for us in any way. So that that hasn't changed. There's this idea that somehow that Black and brown girls are not worthy of the support that we need in order to survive, in order to overcome generational poverty. So unfortunately, the economic systems and the economic structures are reinforced by institutions in such a way that they consistently fail us.
Yeah. I mean, something that you and I were talking about on the phone a few days ago was about how, you prepare and protect the girls in your community to be living in this system that is not helping at best and is actively working against them at worst. So how do you communicate with your girls and try to put faith, I mean, especially with your, parallel personal story?
Yeah, and I think that's probably like one of the hardest things, is to be able to help and teach girls to have hope and faith at the same time. When I'm constantly getting, conversations, and we're having discussions about failure after failure, loss after loss, when you don't really have any family structure, and you're just imagine being a young girl that's moving from home to home, place to place, a young girl who has dealt with every system, right? So not just foster care, but she's dealing with racism, she's dealing with sexism, she's dealing with classism, right? She's dealing with the fact that she's not enough, or that she has some type of disability, and so it's very challenging a lot of times to be able to say things are going to work out and have hope. So a lot of times what I will do is use my backstory. A lot of times what we do is we show up, right? So in the middle of a crisis, we show up just to lend support, provide an ear. Prior to COVID, we would go and maybe sit down and have a cup of tea, but right, so that has changed, right? Unfortunately, because of COVID. So we do a lot of Zoom calls, or we'll do face-to-face. We do, the crisis intervention calls to help girls so that they can understand that this moment is temporary and it's not permanent. So being able to provide services for her, or bridge gaps that she may be experiencing, that a young girl may be experiencing, is also very important in order to be able to do that. And I'm
Wow.
going to say too, I think it's nothing like having someone to show up for you when traditionally you haven't had like a real adult, in your life to be able to show you how to progress and what do. And this reminds me of one of my young people who was formerly incarcerated, and she wanted to apply for college. And so we went through the process, and she, one of the things that we stayed on the phone like on a Sunday for about 2 hours, just going over the classes and teaching her like how to register, teaching her what classes are sequential for the particular major, that she desires to go into. So all those things are so important in terms of being able to learn and being able to educate and teach and train young people. So if we really want them to overcome, the intersectionalities of racism, poverty, classism, we have to be able to teach and train them and guide them and show them, right? So one of the things I'm very big on is girls' leaderships and girls' independence, teaching girls how to lead, how to be independent of us, of Girl Vow, and so that way they can do things on their own so that they can make their own mark in the world.
How have you seen kind of, your own work as well as these initiatives of empowering the girls the girls who you work with? How has that kind of changed with COVID? I mean, you've mentioned that you've been doing more of like Zoom calls and things like that, but I'm sure kind of, like the isolation, the confinement, the distance, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it's hard and it's tough for girls, right? Because we like to talk, we like to hang out, so we like to have our own space. So it's very difficult a lot of times for our young people to be able to do that. So a lot of messenger calls, a lot of FaceTime, a lot of, Zoom. And I've also done a couple of home visits since COVID for my cases that I know they really need more attention. So we've been doing that. We're going to open back up this month, later on this month. So we're looking forward to reopen the organization and to really start to rebuilding back again. Of course, it's going to look different in terms of how we work and how things are structured, but we're really looking forward to being able to support young people. And also, the courts are closed. So one of the things that we do is advocate for young people who have court cases. For those cases that are stagnant, so we're still in contact with those young people to make sure that they have support, food, and they have like the necessities or the basics. And we have a young girl that's homeless, then we work to make sure to ensure that she has shelter.
So some of your work focuses on youth who are LGBTQ plus.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, how are LGBTQIA plus individuals affected by these compounded issues of race, gender, sexuality on top of, poverty, classism, living in our COVID-19 world?
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue because the issue and the thing about, like I was saying earlier, like you can't separate COVID and poverty, right? So poverty has remained in existence, not mutually exclusive. So poverty has been there, and COVID has really just really helped us to examine what's happening in our communities, particularly when you talk about the LGBTQ IA community. Part of the problem that's been the ongoing problem is that they're living in a masculine world, right? A masculine and often a very heterosexual world where they're not accepted. So in order for them to be accepted, you have to show up as someone else. And that's a huge issue. It's a huge burden. We're talking about, unemployment, the national rate of employment being 5%, but for LGBTQ population is 15%. Or, reportings of 90% of discrimination or 41% of suicide attempts, right? And higher rates of poverty, right? So we're looking at a bit through a very specific lens. We see that there's so many differences in terms of like the experiences, in terms of even like the underreporting for criminal cases, or if they've been like violated or victims of any type of abuse, right? There's a lot of underreporting that's going on because they're too afraid to report, right? So and the voices are not loud enough for me when it comes to the LGBTQIA community. It's not loud enough. So when we talk about LGBTQ community, not only do we talk about and in transgender, we also have to include them, as women, trans women as women. So when we say women, we have to think about how do we include them in our language and our discourse and what we speak and what we say. So, you spell women WOMXN, right? And so we remove the E so that it's inclusive. So there's things that we should do within our own communities to make sure that people are protected, right? Because we want to make sure that everyone is protected and that no one is left out.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's really important. I mean, we've talked about representation and the importance of showing up. I mean, as I know that one kind of aspect, a great place to have someone to show up for you is in education, is through teachers. But now, I mean, and that, the education system also is embedded with racism and sexism and the school to prison pipeline. So I just kind of wanted to begin kind of our discussion about education and COVID-19 with how has like one of our viewers, it's actually my mom, she wrote it, how has the school shift from in-person to remote learning impacted your community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the education system is failing our communities. It's failing our Black and brown communities. We're talking about young people who often are in educational systems where they don't feel like they belong. They may not be getting the lessons. So one of the things that I do, we work in a jail called Rikers Island that's here in New York City, in the women's jail. And the first time that I walked into Rikers Island, I want to say they may have been, our census about that time was about 50 to 60 girls, just in one spot. I can't tell you the amount of girls that couldn't tell, it could only tell digital time, right? So the amount of girls that couldn't read, right? So the educational system, excuse me, has failed us tremendously. And so to move from in-person to virtual overnight, you can imagine how that has impacted our community, right? So, particularly working with transient girls, and if I'm working with girls that are working to survive, and they may be sex survivors, their focus is not the educational system, right? Their focus is survival, and rightfully so, right? Their focus is being able to put a meal in their stomach or a roof over their head for that night, right? So the educational system has done, I think, a poor job in being able to not only understand the community that we work with, the very specific population that we work with, but also in educating in such a way that it really speaks to Black and brown communities. So it's unfortunately, it's one of those things that it takes time to dismantle. It takes time to undo. There's been so many laws and policies and rules that don't really support the needs of Black girls in the educational system. So unfortunately, it's impacted us in such a negative way.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we've spoken a bit with Girl Up and other in our previous social media webinars and Instagram lives about, adultification and the impact of adultification of young Black girls on the criminalization. And I just wondered if you wanted to speak a bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about adultification in a way where we decide for some reason that Black girls are no longer worthy of being treated like a child, right? Because they may be too brash, too harsh. They may behave a certain way, right? That's not in alignment with the culture wherever it is that they are currently residing in, or that they live in, or that they go to school in, where they attend school, right? So think about adultification in a way where girls are considered, like Black girls are considered too bossy and too sassy because maybe you don't like the way that their hair looks, or because they respond in an adult-like in a grown way. But think about it also like as that being part of our culture and our community in terms of how we govern ourselves and how we're taught. At a very young age, oftentimes when you don't have parents, you have to be adult-like because you have to take care of yourself. You have to fend for yourself and you have to show up. It reminds me of a young person that I have who who's experiencing the same thing. She doesn't look like a 14-year-old. She doesn't look like, I have another one that doesn't look like a 15-year-old, nor do they speak like one. But the reality is that they haven't had the support that they need in order to be children. So it makes me want to say, how dare you not support girls because they show up in a different way? How dare you not support girls because you feel like they're too bold and they're too brass? And how dare you not support girls because they decide that they want to act a certain way? Because there's this sort of like tone of judgment that takes place when a girl walks in and she's not who you think that she should be. So it's a very, it's a very sad, and it's so many different negatives, and there's so many different ways that have cultivated and created a space where girls are not accepted and learn that they're devalued. And just think about, from the time that you're young until the time that you're a young adult, all the stuff that you learn, all the negative reinforcement that you hear about yourself, about who you are, about what you're not going to be, about how you're unworthy. How do you expect a girl to show up in the world as an adult, as a productive adult in the world? How do you expect her to be whole? How do you expect her to be an educator, or to be a college student? How do you expect these things of her when you've already created a path and an avenue for her to fail over and over again, which goes back to our institutions in terms of reinforcing the idea of failure to young Black and brown girls.
I just wanted to pause here and just reiterate to our attendees here, if you have any questions, send them into the, oh, here we go, perfect. What challenges has Girl Vow, this is from Poppy, what challenges has Girl Vow faced doing intersectionality on the ground in the context of rising division over, for example, trans inclusion and sex worker inclusion and feminist work? I'm always keen to learn from other activists about this. I find it increasingly hard to get on with important feminist liberation work when there's so much criticism from the outside on who qualifies for women's services and feminist solidarity.
Mm-hmm. So that's a loaded question. It's so much. I want to make sure I can cover as much as possible.
Yeah.
So the challenges are always funding. Funding is a big challenge. So I can look at it from a couple of different lenses. So I can look at it from doing the direct work in terms of nonprofit. We can look at it from the actual people that we serve, and we could look at it from in terms of like a funding lens, right? So if we look at it from myself being an African American girl, and we talked about this, right? Being an African American girl that created a nonprofit that really has dealt with, like I said, a lot of the same core issues that our population focuses on and works with. One of the big issues is being able to have access. So that's a huge issue, having access in order to be able to do our work, right? So I need to have access in order to make sure that my young people have access so that they can be stable. So not having access is a huge issue for us. Not being able, and this is something that I've learned from my other counterparts who also work in nonprofits and women of color who run nonprofits. The fact that we don't trust Black women and girls, the fact that we don't trust the stories, right, of Black women and girls, the fact that there is a color of law that does not exist to protect us, or it excludes us, that includes trans women. I talk about women, I talk about trans women and girls as well. And gender expansive youth, excuse me. So doing this type of work on the ground is very difficult because oftentimes the supports aren't there. When we talk about institutions and much larger institutions, sometimes they're so big that they fail, right? So there's no way that young people should be falling through the cracks because an organization is so big that it fails, that it doesn't respond, that it doesn't show up, that it doesn't provide diapers for, a family, or that there's food insecurity or housing insecurity. So there is a lot of things that are happening in terms of failure on much larger institutions that is really impacted the way that we do our work and how we do our work. I think that also because of, let me see what the other question was. The other thing in terms of sex work. So when I first started Girl Vow, my very first client was a young lady who was a sex survivor, and she was her and another young lady was actually running their own sex ring. 15 and 16 years old. One of them, her mom was bipolar schizophrenic, and Her father had abandoned her, and the other one, her mother was just emotionally unavailable. And so one of the problems that I found is that a lot of times larger institutions don't really understand the work, because they don't come from that environment. They don't come from the culture. They're separated or detached from what's really happening on the ground, and the groundwork and the things that are happening in young girls' lives. So oftentimes, and then the other thing is that I think oftentimes there's also a lot of division in doing the work, because there's sort of like this consensus, if you will, amongst a lot of my friends who are trans, that heterosexual women don't know how to show up for them, or that they don't show up for them correctly. So that is one of the big issues, and it's something that it's unfortunately it's very divisive in terms of like, how do we come together as a group, right, to support one another so that we can move towards healing, so that we can interrupt patterns of abuse, of systemic abuse. So it's very, very difficult, unfortunately, and she's right, I think Poppy is right. It's very difficult to move on with feminist work if we don't stick together, if we don't heal, if we don't learn from one another, if we don't sit down and have a discourse in such a way where it benefits us as a whole, and where we can all support one another. And I hope I answered all of her questions.
Yeah, we just have a question from By Paul Blanco, just to follow up with that. How can we show up for trans women correctly, but also maybe more in general, as Abigail just mentioned in the group, like what actions can we take? How can we show up, as allies?
Well, one of the things I talked about is language, right? So language is very important in making sure that it's inclusive of all women. Find a group that's in your area, support, say, hey, my name is, I'm looking to support, I want to be able to do X, Y, and Z. I'm skilled in these particular areas. Do that. The other thing I would say is fight for legislation, right? Fight for legislation. Help support legislation to change the laws that support trans women, that support all women, right? So I think it's very important that we're able to do that, because doing so, it really lends this idea and shows and illustrates that we want to show up for trans women, and that they're just as important as anyone else, and there really shouldn't be any division.
Just kind of switching gears kind of back to our education conversation about school to prison pipeline. So in Push Out, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, she advocates for replacing the school to prison pipeline phrase with the school to confinement pathways when describing Black girls' carceral and confinement experiences outside of jail or prison. And by using this phrase, the school to confinement pathways, she highlights that educational factors that impact a girl's risk of confinement and numerous other forms of social exclusion, such as house arrest, detention centers, and electronic monitoring. And as soon as I read this, I couldn't help but connect this to the hashtag Free Grace movement that's going around all over social media, and how, for those of you who aren't aware, Grace, so hashtag Free Grace movement is about a 15-year-old Black girl who was incarcerated in juvenile detention for not completing her online schoolwork. So I wanted to ask you, Dawn, like what happened to Grace, how are we seeing the school to confinement pathways adapt to this virtual or online education? How is this system still functioning?
Yeah, so it's doing so poorly. I think that what the educational system fails to realize, in the middle of a pandemic, you also have young people that are dealing with issues of mental health. You have young people that don't have access to Wi-Fi. You have young people that don't have access to employment. Right? So there's so many things that are happening that really discourages education, right? Education doesn't become a priority when your basic needs are being met. And like I said early on, I feel like the education has really failed us. Has really failed young girls. Even when it comes to Grace, I think that's a great example of state violence, right? So you educate a girl for not doing her homework. I'm floored. I'm floored. And like doing this work, you see a lot of things that happen. You see a lot of infighting. You see a lot of times where young people who are on the verge of incarceration or have been incarceration are fighting like with staff in schools. You see where they don't, they may not get along with their teachers and they're punished for that. They're punished for how they respond. They're punished for the way that they show up in the world. So that's really been a huge issue. Most of the young people that we work with have had a really hard time doing virtual work outside of school, because they need face-to-face, they may need one-on-one, they may need counseling, they may need tutoring, they may have an IEP, right? So they may have, like I said early on, a mental health issue. So how do you move from being in a place where a young person can actually drop into school, right, sit in a desk and get support and help, and from not only from teachers, but from other faculty that's in the school, right, to not being able to have that at all, particularly if you're in a foster care system or a foster care home that does not support your needs and your wants, that is not training you for life. How do you do that on your own when you've never done that before? So the educational system really needs to put system in place moving forward to really be able to support young people in such a way where they can have access to additional supports outside of the school network, so that way that they can complete their schoolwork and also be able to graduate. Yeah, wow. I think, yeah, to not to do so is a great example of state violence.
Yeah, completely. Kind of perfect shift to another important element of state violence is the American foster care system. So I wondered if you could kind of explain some of the parallels that you've seen between the foster care system and the juvenile justice system.
Yeah. So some of the things that I've seen in terms of the foster care system and the juvenile justice system, one time I had a case in foster care, and a young lady, there was a young lady who, she had a mental illness, and I was asked to service her. So when I went to go meet with her, I met with her the first time, she was asleep. I met with her the second time, she was asleep. By the third time, I'm like, okay, what's going on with her? Come to find out, she's so heavily medicated that she can't respond. It's very common. Like, so I had to say to them, well, I can't help her. I can't talk to her because I don't know who she is, right? So in order for me to be able to provide a service for her, I have to know who it is. So imagine that same young lady showing up in a jail system. So I talked about earlier walking into a jail where it's like 50 to 60, Black and brown girls ages between 16 to 21. This is like in 2017 prior to Raise the Age, right? So, and the commonality between them was the foster care system. It's abandonment. So girls are incarcerated, girls in the foster care system is, like I said, overly medication, being abandoned, being isolated, being unheard, being silenced, right? So those are much being victims of sex abuse, being sex workers and sex survivors, failing out of the educational system, no one believing their stories, right? Feeling unheard, being victims of domestic violence. Those are all the criteria for a young person who is gonna, unfortunately, most likely wind up in the incarceration system because no one has interrupted the cycle before it happened. When I talked about early on when I was a young girl and how I walked in school and how my teacher kicked me out because I hadn't been there in a while. But the problem, what I realized and what the problem is, sorry. And what the problem is, oftentimes, it's easy to want to indict someone, right? It's easy to want to condemn someone for not showing up, opposed to asking them and saying, what happened to you? Why are you not here? Did you sleep last night? Or where did you sleep last night? How are you surviving, right? So you have to be able to ask those critical questions in order to make a determination on how you're going to service that young girl. So the same day that I walked into the classroom and I was thrown out, I went to my other teacher and she did those things for me. She said, how are you surviving? And I told her, I said, I just tried to commit suicide. I just got out of the hospital and I came straight here to school. And if my other teacher would have stopped to ask me those questions instead of just reprimanding me, then she would have known that. And I'm seeing the same thing time and time again, working with young people and working with girls who are in foster care, who have been impacted in such a negative way that they have lost absolutely all hope. Right now, we're dealing also with young people who are aging out of foster care, right? So there's no systems in place for young people that are aging out during COVID-19. There should be an automatic extension for young people who are aging out and are dealing with COVID-19. There should be an automatic, but that's not, unfortunately, that's not the case. So we need to have more support for young people in the foster care system so that they don't continue on the path to incarceration, that they don't continue on to path into failure, into homelessness, and the continuum of being in shelter after shelter and being in abusive relationships. It's something that I think that we have to interrupt, and we have to do so in a way that supports all our young people.
Wow. Just kind of reading over the comments here. Antonia says we need more support in schools, and Eileen mentions, or at any time for aging out. And that is the biggest problem. They need housing periods so they can stay in school and find a job.
Yeah. So I mean, I just think about the numbers in terms of COVID, and how even when we had some of our young girls that were moving out of Rikers Island, when COVID first hit in March, they couldn't even get housing. Right. And so for some young people, part of their release was the judge required for them to have housing. So if you don't have housing, you stay in jail, you stay incarcerated. So so how do you solve that? How do you fix that of institutions? Like, how do you change the rules and change, what's happening to make sure that young people don't see their only hope as incarceration, or they don't see their only community in jails? I've had young people to say, I keep coming back because this is where my family is. This is where I get structure. Everyone knows me here. And that it's so sad. Like the first time I heard that, I gasped for air, because I couldn't believe that a young person would think that this is their only route. The only route out is dealing with incarceration to help them in order to survive, that they couldn't be on the streets, and they couldn't survive on the streets, that they would actually need to stay in jail in order to survive and make something of themselves. So, I think continuing with programs, continuing support for programs, being able to provide economic and employment for young people, right? Being able to provide employment for young people, and a livable wage at that, right? Providing a livable wage. If the United States can give out $1 trillion overnight, they can change how we support communities. They can change how they show up. They can change what they do for the communities that we work with. They can do so much more.
I mean, this kind of transition's really great. So how has kind of this funding, I mean, we're seeing, for those who aren't in the States right now, the federal government has sent out some home checks, some funding, but there are requirements that are in place to get those. So I'm just wondering, and it's not as much as people need. So I was just wondering, Dawn, how have those federal checks come to the hands of the people who need them the most?
That's a great question. I like to know where the checks are. Like, show me the money. But no, that's a serious question. And I think that it's, even if you get funding, it's not enough, right? Mm-hmm. So the funding pre-COVID would have been enough to sustain, right? But now when you go on, like, let's say, like the government's website for grants or funding, like, there's no funding. There's no funding, there's no money, right? So how do you continue to do this work without funding? How do you continue to do this work and provide, emergency, crisis support, financial crisis support for families when there's no funding? So, it's really a challenge, and it's something that we wrestle with, and a lot of organizations are wrestling with. I had a friend just call me the other day to tell me that his whole entire organization just closed because of the funding. So, the support system and, nonprofits are so vital to the community, because we do the work that the government can't do, right? We show up when the government can't show up. So not having the funding to do the work, it really speaks to what we talked about earlier in terms of the structural inequalities that have taken place, right? And the oppressive isms that are happening when we talk about racism, classism, like, et cetera, like the oppressive isms that are happening and that continue to happen, and that will continue to permeate our communities because there's not enough government entities showing up for us in such a way to support the work that we're doing. So it's really really unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. Yeah.
Just going back to the chat here, Eileen says, I cannot believe it either, but I understand what they mean about needing family. Many people go to jail on purpose for that reason. Even if the housing that is created for them is maintained by them, that there's still job training. She also goes on to say, it's not just custodial, it's administrative too. Why not do what the government does, which is to appeal to people with deep pockets who would support the cause?
I think part of the problem with that is the people that have deep pockets are supporting the government. Like, so, right, so they get to choose which politicians they want to fund and support, and what the backdoor deals, right? So all those things that happen, right? So I mean, it's great in theory, but the reality is that a lot of times it just does not happen. Even when we talk about the funding for Black girls and women, like it just doesn't, it just, like the funding is not there. It doesn't happen. Like the numbers are not there to fund to fund Black women and girls organizations. It's a fight for just us to obtain funding, not only obtain it, but also to maintain the funding that we need in order to continue to do the work. It's unfortunately, it's very common. So we're working to not only to make sure that we are able to stabilize our families, but also stabilize the organization as well. I think it's so important to be able to continue to work. I mean, I think about myself as a young girl, you know, dealing with the things that I've dealt with. You know, what have happened if I didn't have that teacher that day, right? So what would have happened to me? Would I have finished, you know, high school? Would I have gone on to college and completed college? Like, would I be able to do the things that I'm doing today? I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it, because oftentimes it takes one person, you know, to tap you on the shoulder to say, hey, you know what, I see you're valuable, you're smart, you're intelligent, you're a go-getter. You know, I have a dream for you, you know, and I want you to dream the same way that I dream for you, and have a conversation about what that is and how you can do those things.
Wow. I mean, beautiful and wise words. Definitely needed to be heard. Just kind of going back to, I mean, we've spoken a bit about this, about how to, you know, encourage faith and hope in these systems that aren't working. So one of the questions that I've received is, how do we encourage women to report, as the number of reported race cases is very low and is very alarming? And I think this kind of speaks to, you know, the structural racism and sexism that's inbuilt in, and that's embedded in our systems and institutions. So, you know, what do we do with that, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that it's important to remind young women and girls that they are supported, that they have a whole bunch of cheerleaders that's behind them, that they're standing on the shoulders of giants, that they're not forgotten, that they're important, that we need them, that we want to see them excel and succeed and flourish. I think it's important that if we can, that we provide additional supports for women and girls. So if you have a young person that needs, I don't know, employment, let's say, for example, that if you have a connection with someone or a partnership with someone, that you help that young person, you know, to obtain gainful employment. Sometimes it's good to just knock on a neighbor's door if you see a young person that's in need. Just sit down and maybe have a conversation with them. You might learn a lot. I think because oftentimes we're all so busy that we live in silos most of the time, so we don't get a chance to know what's happening in our community or who's in our community that's in need. So if we stop for a moment to have a conversation, which I think that's one of the things that COVID, of course, COVID is definitely a curse, but there's also some blessings in COVID, in terms of us being able to have conversations and get to know our neighbors and get to know one another. And even just realize that the need is as great as it is, right? Because sometimes when we are able to achieve the things that we need to, we forget, you know, what the needs of others are. So the fact that COVID and, you know, has really allowed us to really see like the devastation of communities and the way that so many people are losing their lives and their families all at once. So if we sometimes just knock on the door and just say hello, or maybe just help someone with their groceries and just do, you know, an act of kindness, commit to an act of kindness, I think it definitely goes a long ways.
We've just got a question from Soonbal. So good to see you here again. She asks, so there's literally no mainstream policy for accommodating girls aging out of foster care? And are there no programs for promoting education, employment?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there's a lot of not, well, fortunately rather, there's a lot of nonprofits that are doing the work. But in terms of on a national level, there's not. I know that there's an organization here in New York City called GGE, where they have a national agenda for Black girls. But that work needs to be elevated. It needs to be uplifted. And I think that's how we can overcome that. And the other thing is, right now we're living in time of change and transformation. So if you want something done, or if you see that there's a need, like, this is the time for it. This is the time to stand in front of your elected officials and hold them accountable, because because what time greater or better than now? This, like I said, this is a time of transformational change. There's also a lot of groups that are doing a lot of groundwork, that are advocating, that are protesting. So it's important to be able to, if you want, if something that you're interested in, also protest. Like, speak out at things that are happening in your community. A couple of weeks ago, some of the girls and I, we actually went to a protest for Black women and girls, right? So you can do some things in your community that really change the way that that society responds to us, right? So at this point, it's up to us, and don't diminish your own power. Don't diminish your own power in being able to do the work and change what's happening in our society. Like, it can be done. And women, we're strong. We're very strong, right? There's really nothing that we can't do. We're very strong, and as a collective, we're even stronger.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about the protests that I've seen on your guys' social media, and say how incredible they've been just to be able to watch and participate in virtual time. I think this is a good transition to kind of talking about the hashtag Say Her Name and bringing about the visibility of the racist, brutal, murderous police force on Black women and girls. So just wanted to know, I mean, you've mentioned how a lot of the girls in your community, they've really experienced a lot of this stuff firsthand. Yeah. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a young girl who was shot by the police, I want to say 4 times in the chest. I've had young girls that have been beat up by police, abused by police officers. And, unfortunately, it's a system that's supposed to protect us, but it's not protective of us. And so the fact that we have to even have a hashtag that says Say Her Name, or the fact that, we have Breonna Taylor, who her murderers still haven't been arrested, or the fact that we have someone like Corinne Gaines, who was shot by the police, her and her son, she was murdered, her son, about 5 years of age, was also shot. The fact that we have to even have lawsuits, civil lawsuits, well, we can't have civil lawsuits just because of qualified immunity, but lawsuits against the state for police brutality and murder of girls and women. And, I really believe that Black girls and women, we don't have enough, there's not enough education in terms of the way that it affects us and how it affects us in the fight and how we have to fight. There's not enough education in terms of how cruel it is, the overall impact, the mental health impact, the amount of women and girls that can't sleep at night because of police brutality, or seeing their loved ones be abused by police brutality. One person in particular that comes to mind, I don't know if you know who Eric Garner is, but Eric Garner, I don't know if you heard the name, so you guys know, I'm seeing nods. So I always think about his daughter, Erica Garner, and how she fought so hard for her dad, and she wound up dying of a heart attack, right? So there's consequences to this. When police officers murder families, they don't just murder families, but that individual, but they murder families, right? Because there's an impact, there's a long-standing and generational impact, because now you have a life that's lost. And when you feel like there's no justice, how can you sleep at night? Wouldn't you want to fight for your family member, God forbid, if something like that was to happen? I know I would, right? So people we're tired, we're hurting. And the other thing, there's this, there's even the hashtag of Black Girls Magic, and I think that's unfortunately a misnomer, because there's this idea that we're just strong, that we can take it, that we can deal with it, that we can handle whatever comes our way, and that's not true. And it's the reason why oftentimes we don't seek mental health assistance. Like, it's so taboo. It's so difficult for me to get my young people, to seek mental health, because there's like this sort of like idea that, like, you want to say, well, there's nothing wrong with me. Like, I don't need, I'm not crazy, right? So there's this idea that I'm not crazy. And when in reality, it's a conversation that needs to be had. It's a conversation to be able to release, right? It's okay to release. It's okay to cry, that we don't always have to be strong, right? So, there's this, it's a blessing, and then it's also a curse, at the same time, because tags like Say Her Name, it brings, light to the fact that there's something that's going on, right? So people can say that there's some type of injustice, that's happening. The fact that we have this hashtag that's gone viral of Say Her Name, but then at the on the opposite end, we're saying Black Girl Magic. So which one is it? So sometimes it can be very contradictory, although I think and believe that they definitely mean well. But we have to remember that, that as Black women and girls, that we need just as much support and help too, and that we can't do it alone. And let's hold police accountable.
Yeah. Just a question I've received. So what are the specific challenges that Black women face in the context of police that look different and manifest differently from Black men?
The fact that, and this is not to mitigate the experiences of Black men, but I think the fact that that we don't talk about police brutality against women the way that we should. We don't really know all the names of the women who've been affected like we should. We know the names like Sandra Bland, right? But that's because she was plastered all over CNN and all over like the newspapers, and there were and because her mother spoke out and her family spoke out. But there's so many Black women and girls that we don't know their names, we don't know their stories, or the experiences, the experiences of Black women and girls have died down, right? So it becomes a hashtag that has died, where we don't continue to move forward and advance towards the needs and change the laws that really support and protect, Black women. So that really needs to be changed in terms of how we show up for Black women and what we do to support Black women, and just also to end the crisis against Black women and girls that are toxic.
A question from Poppy in the chat. Do you feel that anti-racist demonstrations are centering women's experiences? There are hierarchies within liberation movements themselves, which is a painful lesson to learn and a complex issue to understand. In terms of whose voices and experiences represent the movement.
Yeah, I think I want to say yes and no. Because there are groups that I think that are doing very well. For someone, for example, Tamika Mallory comes to mind, right? In terms of centering like the message and what's happening. And there are many groups that are doing the work to center the message on what's happening. I mean, you're always gonna have opposing viewpoints. And I think it's also, it's up to what people wanna hear, right? And what they wanna receive, right? So that's why it's so important that we educate about what's happening, so that the message doesn't get lost. And like I said earlier, in terms of reaching out to organizations to find out what exactly is happening, what's going on, and how things need to change, or how we need to support organizations that are doing this critical work.
Yeah, I mean, I thought of Tarana Burke and how, Times Magazine included a whole section on Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and, how many important Black women who've been at the forefront of these huge movements that have just been made invisible.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, it's something that we're always going to have to combat, the invisibility. We're always going to unfortunately have to combat that. But as long as we continue to have like discussions like these and forums and conversations, and, once the world opens back up, right? Once we continue to have those types of conversations, we can address the issues of racism and sexism and classism. And, and like I said earlier, on the oppressive isms that really keep us from moving forward and sort of silence our voices. But I don't think that we are going away at all anytime soon in terms of the organizations that advocate and fight for Black women and girls. I mean, from the time as a woman of color, from the time that you're born, all you know that you have to do is fight so that you can be heard, so that you can show up, so that when you knock on the door and you know, that you can be led into the boardroom. So we only know, unfortunately, that's the only thing that we know is this fight. So we can't afford to give up, because our lives are at stake, and then the lives of the young people who we work and fight for are also at stake. So it's something that we can't stop doing. So we have to always work on centering and continuing the message. And I think Girl Up is doing a great job at that. Amazing job.
Well, thank you. Just want to use this opportunity to kind of open the floor here and allow anyone to go off mute if they'd like to, you know, share a question and experience. This is a opportunity to do so. If not, I have more questions, so no worries.
She's ready. She's ready.
I just wanted to thank Dawn for being here, and going back to what you said about having that one teacher, like you don't know where you'd be now. And we're thankful that you're here today, that you can offer this insight and the work that you do. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not really educated into the whole problem, but I'm trying to. That's why I'm here.
Good.
I think that yes, as a community, that for example, in the police brutality part, we need to be aware of that and protect ourselves. Like the community has to protect itself, right? But we also need like the other part, I think, to like the police to be re-educated or defunded, or some solutions, because we cannot go out there in the world saying, take care of every man. We should talk to the man and be like, yo, what you doing, man? So, yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because accountability is everything, right? So if we use our money and our taxpayer dollars to fund police, fund institutions, then we have to hold them accountable. But I think we also have to hold ourselves accountable, right? So, you know, as if I'm walking down the street and I see someone being harmed or, you know, being hurt, it's my responsibility to say something. It's my responsibility to stand up. And as a community, one of the things that we're learning is that it's our responsibility collectively to stand up for young women and girls that are being abused, whether it be by police or anyone else. Even when it comes to recording, like what's happening, right? So having actual proof and evidence, it makes a world of difference to have a video of what's happening, so that way, you know, we can support women and girls as well. The other thing I want to say is that when it comes to support of women and girls, and I thank you for wanting to be educated and just for being here, because we need male support, we need male presence, because oftentimes I see that, you know, women show up for men when it comes to like issues like Black Lives Matter, but I don't see the men showing up at a lot of times at women's movements. And it's disheartening, and it speaks to what we talked about earlier in terms of, you know, how institutions operate. So when I worked in like the jail at Rikers Island, the women were not getting the support that they needed. Like even on visit day, the men's jail is crowded. You can't even get a seat. The women's jail, no one shows up. No family events, no family. So I would also implore you to even, you know, if you can, do some volunteer work, like in jails where, you know, where women are. Like you'll be surprised to hear the stories and the way that, you know, young women and girls are so resilient, and the life experiences that they've had, that the reality is that it could be any one of us in their positions. Like it's been so many times I've seen myself in the eyes of young girls that I work with that are incarcerated, that are facing 10, 15, and 20 years, and some even life. So it's, you know, it's important that we have, you know, young men, and that we educate and teach our young men and boys at a very young age on what the issues are, so they know what to do and what not to do, and they know what's toxic and what's not toxic, and what's accepted and what's not accepted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Yeah, Dawn, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the COVID-19's impact, you know, on these jails, on these women's prisons and women's jails.
So unfortunately, because of COVID-19, we're not working in the jails right
Yeah.
now. So we're getting, so I did get some, like some, what you call it, grapevine information. So like a person tells a person, but you know how that goes, right? Right? A person tells a person, and sometimes like the messaging gets lost. But there was a lot of conversation in regards to lack of PPEs, not being supported, not knowing what's happening, being limited on what they hear and what they know and what they see about what's happening. You can't get any visits from any family, so there's no program showing up. And a lot of times it's, you know, you have a lot of young girls that are also suffering because of it. So there's a lot of suffering, unfortunately. So what I try to do oftentimes is I try to get calls. Right, I try to make it so that the young people can call me who are incarcerated, that are still in jail. So that way they know that we haven't forgotten them, because it's very easy to believe that no one cares about you when you're sitting in a jail cell and like no one has shown up in months. So remember, COVID hit us in March here in New York City. So, you know, from March to August, no visits, no calls. So it's really terrifying right now. It's really terrifying. And it's very limited in terms of the information that we're receiving, unfortunately.
Well, I just wanted to thank Eileen for her incredible messages in the chat. She's saying, probably because by nature, women are the backbone and the makers of a home and the glue of families. We are the nurturers. She continues and says, have a great afternoon, all. I found your organization on Facebook to follow, and I'll be spreading the word about your organization and looking for some deep pockets for your hands and not the government. So thank you, Eileen, if you're still with us. I just wanted to kind of turn to Isabella's question. Does Girl Vow partner with other NGOs to support these girls/women? Is there a sponsorship program?
Yeah, we do. We do work with other organizations. And so because of COVID, one of the things that we've been working on is expanding our partnerships. And actually creating a sponsorship program. In the middle of doing that right now. But if there's an organization that's interested in partnering with us, like I said, we're having a lot of conversations right now. We're definitely open to partnerships, and we're looking forward to it, because in order to be effective and grow the work, we know that we have to work collectively, and we have to work within community in order to do that. So look forward, and my email is open. Email is open. So.
Well, Dawn, I was hoping kind of to wrap up here with, if you could tell us, you know, maybe just something that you would want us to take away with, you know, in our everyday life. If there's one thing to really not forget about from this conversation. I mean, like any of us could forget this, but, you know, what should we be taking into our day-to-day lives? And then, you know, we've talked about this earlier, but what can we as individuals, you know, those of us who are still on here, how, you know, what are other ways that we can show up if we're, you know, not living in the United States? I know a lot of us here in South America and the UK.
So you guys, so there's a lot of South America and UK that's on the Zoom. So one of the things I would say is get involved, like in your communities for women and girls. Get involved, and if there's organizations in your communities for women and girls, get involved. If there's not organizations, create one. Right? Create one. Once COVID-19 is over, maybe just show up and see if you can do some volunteer work. Maybe you can mentor a girl into a career path that she didn't think about or that she doesn't have access to. Access is really a big deal for Black women and girls. Consistency, particularly for our population, is very, very, very important, because they're so used to and accustomed to being abandoned. If you can adopt a child. I think that's important. Give a child a home if you can do that. Don't forget about the needs of women and girls. Don't forget about the hashtag. You know, say her name. It's so important and it's so vital. The other thing I would say, we need more women to run for office. We need more women in politics that understand, you know, what's happening and how things are working in the system. We need better access. For those that are directly affected, need to have better access in order to be able to do this work, who understand the work directly. And And the other thing there's something here, like in New York City, it's called, if you see something, say something. So I would even use that. If you see something, say something. If you see an inconsistency, if you see something happen that's immoral, say something. Of course, and you do that in a safe way, as safe as possible. But just, show up for a Black girl, show up for trans women, show up, and show up for one another, and be committed, to this work. The work is, it's not easy at all. This work is not easy at all when you're dealing with families and when you're dealing with lives and hardships, and right, those hardships don't happen from 9 to 5, right? Those hardships happen within a 24-hour period. So if you can do something or give back in some way, I really implore you to do that, because it makes a world of difference when someone comes and wants to support and wants to be helpful, and that we can do something to help other young girls that are in need. So I would appreciate that, so much,
I just want to open it up one last time just to see if anyone else who's on here wants to say anything or ask any question. Well, if not, Dawn, I want to sincerely thank you. Oh, here we have from Alexis Vow. Women of color are often taught by family and community to be strong, or you are strong enough to deal with whatever. The conversations need to be had, and they can be difficult and overwhelming conversations. However, when suggestions, outreach, and services are provided, a whole new door opens up to possibilities, and young girls and women's voices can be heard and supported. It's wonderful to hear about Girl Vow. I really enjoyed the discussion and knowledge shared. It actually never occurred to me that women's jails are less frequently visited, and it's quite sad to hear.
Yeah, it is. It's so sad and it's so painful. The other one I want to say too, I think it's important to educate our more seasoned and older communities, because oftentimes they don't know and understand what's happening. So sometimes there could be like cultural boundaries, and even like stigmas that impede on being able to teach about what's happening with women and girls, because it makes a big difference that our elders are involved and that they know and they're knowledgeable of what's happening. And I had a conversation recently with someone, and we were talking about like the number of missing, girls of color, right? We don't hear a lot about missing girls of color. So we're working on an initiative right now to address that. So it's, it's not something that we're alerted about. So, these things, it's so many things, it's so many pathways to incarceration and to failure. So anything that anyone can do here to interrupt that, that's what's important, and it's really how you show up in the world and how you do the work if you want to give back.
One kind of last question. This is kind of a big one here. So we're talking about, these structural inequities that are just so embedded, and it's like these structures were born with these inequalities being in there. I mean, when we're talking about police, when you look at the history of the policing system. So what's our goal? Should we just be trying to dismantle it all? Where should we be hoping for reform when we've seen that reform hasn't worked?
Mm-hmm. So, I would say that those institutions that are too big, they need to be dismantled. I believe that. I believe the institutions that are so big, that are managed with taxpayers' dollars, they need to be dismantled. And that we need to change leadership in terms of how we organize and how we manage those institutions that are not doing the work for young people in the way that it should. It's no cause, there's no reason why a child that's in a foster care system shouldn't have money to eat. She doesn't have money to buy soap and to buy shoes for the essentials. She should have the essentials. She should have the bare minimum. There's no reason why, young people that's in foster care shouldn't have even allowances. They should be able to go out and hang out with their friends and, buy a movie ticket if they wanted to buy a movie ticket. So I believe that those institutions that are so huge and that have so much money and that are so powerful, they need to be dismantled. It might sound radical, but like when you do this work and you see where the numbers are, and you see the a lot of times that, you may have, so like in the nonprofit work, for example, there's a lot of, there's a lot of partnerships, but then there's also this idea of supporting like your friend, right? Someone that you like, or someone that you welcome. And so because of that, a lot of times there's not accountability in this work in the way that it should be. So you might have a young person who is in foster care and is not receiving the proper services that she needs, but because that young person is being managed by the friend of the administrator, it goes unheard and it goes unseen. So those large institutions have to be dismantled. We have to change how we manage institutions. We have to change how we look at institutions, and we have to change how institutions act. I think it's very important that we do that, because when you're too big, a lot of times too many kids fall through the crack, and we're seeing it time and time again. And what happens is that it creates intergenerational trauma that can't be healed, that can't be severed. And this is the reason why, our communities are so decimated. This is the reason why we have the high rates of urban poverty. This is why we have the high rates of food insecurity. This is the reason why COVID has impacted urban communities the way that it has, is because there's always been a foundation that has been structured for poverty, that has been structured, that doesn't really have provide the necessary care that it needs for our communities. And that's why we're seeing the impact of COVID in which we have, particularly in Black or Brown communities, right? So we need, I think it's also urgent that we have a national healthcare initiative, right? So that every family has healthcare, and that it's not tied to work. It's not tied to whether or not you're employed. There should be an initiative, an agenda for healthcare. There's a senator that we work in New York with. His name is Senator Gustavo Rivera, and he's working on the New York, a healthcare initiative and act, so that all families have access to. And it's something that even in the communities where you are, if you have like a group of organizers, if you get together, you can organize and start talking about like the need for national health care and just national inalienable rights that, our communities should have, if you haven't done that already.
Wow. Thank you, Dawn. I mean, seriously, from the bottom of all of our hearts. I mean, just reading through the chat right now, we have Antonia saying, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. It's beautiful to learn about women and their different realities. Jennifer from Mexico says, thank you, Dawn, for such an amazing session. I think your experience and your platform will help us a lot to better understand this problem. In Mexico, we still have a lot of work to do. Black communities still face many of these issues that you mentioned. Thank you. Thanks for the inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I just hope that we can continue to do this work and do so collectively. And, I'm just so happy that everyone's willing to learn and be educated. And, sometimes when we are educated, we only know what we know because we feel like we know so much, right? So we don't take the time out to learn other communities and learn about other cultures and learn about what's happening until it's plastered all over the news. So I appreciate the fact that, people are really interested in learning about what's happening, around the world to women and girls, for women, against women and girls rather. And if we continue to do so, we can really change the narrative of how women and girls are portrayed in dealing with sexism and racism and classism and, sex abuse, et cetera, and being marginalized. We can really change that.
Mm-hmm. Sunbal, I'm gonna leave it off to you for the last final question.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for such an informative session. My question is specifically linked to the girls who are aging out of foster care. Like, it was so saddening to hear, like, literally when they age out, there's like no place for them to go to. So I wanted to ask, does Girl Vow has like a program or agenda for helping them, or we as individuals can help them? Like, is there anything?
Yeah, so because of the work that we do, we meet so many young women that have so many different issues. So initially when I started Girl Vow, the goal was just to provide mentoring. But what happened is that I would meet young people that had so many various and different needs. I'm like, wait a minute. We went from a mentoring program to doing like alternatives to incarceration work, to helping girls out of sex survivors, et cetera. So part of my work is to advocate and fight for girls. So oftentimes I'll go into meetings and I'm like, you know, and I'll hold the agencies accountable to say, you know what, this child hasn't had this service. She hasn't had that. So right now I'm in the process of doing that for a young person that has aged out and they decided that they wanted to put her in a shelter. Right. So she's calling me and she's like, they put me out. I'm like, what do you mean they put you out? Like, they can't just put you out. Right. But part of the problem is that oftentimes young people that are in these places and in unfortunate places, what happens is that when organizations know that they don't know that their rights, they can do what they want with them if nobody is watching. So that's why it's so important, like with my organization, that I hold them accountable and I say, hey, well, I know your responsibility is X, Y, and Z, and that I educate our young people so that they know what their rights are, so that when they go into those meetings that they are well informed and well educated on what's right and what's wrong. And they know that if that doesn't happen, if they go into those meetings and I'm not there or we're not there for whatever reason, that I'm going to make a phone call and I'm going to find out what's happening. I'm going to get to the bottom of it, and that and then I'm going to be looking for answers. So, it makes a world of difference if you have that type of support and you're not 18 or 19 and you're on your own trying to fight a system that really is not designed to help or support you and really is not concerned about supporting you. The other thing I want to say is that even with the incarceration for one child a year in the juvenile justice system is $265,000 per person, right? So, and I talked about earlier how I walked into Rikers Island, which is the jail here in New York City, and how there was about 50 to 60 girls in one room. So 265,000 times 60 people, do the math. Right? So imagine if we could take that money, if we could repurpose that for programs, repurpose that for education, repurpose that for mental health, repurpose that for being able to provide supports for young people where they're really needed, instead of determining who wins and who loses. And that's the problem.
Wow. Well, Dawn, you and Girl Vow do incredible work, and it's truly an inspiration to all of us here. Isabella just wanted to know how big your team is, because you cover so much.
I know, right? I know. I'm like,
how do you have time to breathe? I mean,
I know. I'm tired. But there's 4 of us actually. And prior to that, we had more people, but like with COVID and everything that's happening, like right before COVID hit, we were looking at expanding, we were looking at hiring, and COVID just really changed all of that. So we went from that to just focus on sustaining. So, so we, it's like, you have to ride the wave, right? So for as long as you can and as much as you can. So right now that's where we're at. And it's true, we do a lot of work. To be such a small organization, we do a lot of work. We really do. But it shows like the dedication that we have, for this work, and the commitment that we have for this work. And we understand, and we understand the population, and we know that they have needs that are not going to be met otherwise. And it's, and it's really heartbreaking to hear the stories and see the needs not being met. Like it breaks me to my core, because I know what it feels like, because I've been there. So, this work, like I said, is important to me, and it's just something I'm gonna just ride it until the wheels fall off. So,
well, Dawn, I mean, we can't thank you enough. I can't underestimate or over whatever it is. I can't, this has just been incredible. I mean, I personally have learned so much, and, a lot that's really going to shape, my activism and what that looks like in the future. Yeah, I agree.
That's amazing.
I agree with Antonia here. We admire you. I mean, you are an inspiration, and, you have a global reach now, so we're really excited.
Right, so hit me up, y'all. Hit me up.
Yeah, seriously, we implore you guys, go follow Girl Vow on Instagram. Keep on saying her name. Repost Sandra G. We have to keep on doing this. We can't, yeah, we need to keep this movement. Oh, Antonia goes, greetings from Chile. Thank you so much.
Hey, Chile. So cute. So cute.
Oh, Dawn, do you want to put the handle in the chat on Instagram?
Oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I'll give also my email address as well. And everything is Girl Vow on Instagram. We're mostly more active on IG. So we're very active on IG. We post all the time. So you could always hit us up on IG. You can email me if there's any questions, or I don't know, if you want to collaborate in any type of way. There's always, room for a collaboration and expansion if that's something that you're interested in. If you want to start a program maybe where you live and you don't know how to get started, we could have a conversation about what that looks like. So I'm really open to, just creating new relationships and expanding the work as much as possible.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dawn, again.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the call now, but just thank you. I mean, and Dawn's been doing a ton of speaking events recently, so we really, really want to thank you for coming with Girl Up and joining us for this. So
thank you so much. Thank you, and be well, everyone. Be well.
Be well.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.